Welcome to the end of 2020. There's going to be a lot said and written about 2020 being a year of unprecedented this and unprecedented that. But in our wrap up today, first, before I get into that, I want to thank you all for your support in 2020. Thank you for letting the Complete Wealth family look after your family, and we look forward to a better 2021. So this time of year, before we get into looking at what we think is ahead of us, it's always a good idea, I think, to look back to this time last year and think, well, what were our expectations heading into 2020, and how much of that did we get right, and how much of that actually mattered? And this time last year, we're actually pretty positive. We expected 2020 to be a good year, not necessarily a great year, but definitely not a bad one. If we look at, the way the economic news was sort of shaping up around the world, generally things were in reasonable shape. We found a few things to sort of maybe get a little bit worried about. There's this coronavirus thing that was sort of starting to hit the news a little bit. But that stage certainly wasn't anything like the pandemic that we ended up with. But the general economic news was pretty strong. We saw unemployment pretty much around the world, especially in Australia and the US, was either at or heading towards sort of historical lows. And so that told us, generally speaking, that economies were in reasonable shape, and therefore the opportunity set for investments was pretty wide and in some respects was reasonably deep. And so 2020, we think, held quite a bit of promise. Obviously, this time last year we were facing a lot of the bushfire issues in Australia, and so we kind of had other things on our mind as well. Fast forward 12 months, and 2020 has definitely been a year like no other. But some of the really positive things that I think have come out of 2020 is we really saw the fact that the world is now more prepared than ever to be able to deal with major economic changes. And sure, this time most of those economic changes were sort of geopolitically forced in response to the pandemic. We saw major swathes of the economy sort of shut down or massively adjusted even overnight, and in some respects multiple times. And what we saw in that, though, despite the fact that obviously we had spikes in unemployment and certainly some difficult times for a lot of people, we also saw the resilience we get, especially out of small business and business communities, to pivot and adjust and start to look at doing business in different ways. We had a lot of people working from home. That ability had been there for quite some time, but had really never been taken advantage of. And the pandemic gave us the opportunity to really mobilise a lot of the opportunity that things like technology and cloud computing, etc., had been making available to us for some time, but we'd never really taken advantage of. And that, I think, gives us a really good insight into the possibilities going forward, seeing that businesses can respond to even relatively significant short-term unforeseen changes, gives us a lot of hope in terms of how we might respond in 2021 and beyond. So as it sits today, the end of the year has actually turned out to be reasonably good. Markets have rebounded quite substantially from their lows in sort of late February, early March. And we're starting to see a much more resilient and much more dynamic economy dealing with a lot of the challenges that come from COVID, particularly domestically here in Australia. We're continuing to see border closures, obviously, and we might see a pretty significant interruption to Christmas. But we're learning to do business and learning to run our economy in ways that were probably relatively inconceivable as short as maybe 18 months or 2 years ago. And that gives us a lot of hope for 2021. So what's the outlook for 2021? Well, in many respects, it's very similar to where we were this time last year. Valuations, generally speaking, aren't overly stretched across the markets globally. And the opportunity set, in fact, has, if anything, has got quite wide and in some respects a lot deeper than it was this time last year, because of many of the responses to the pandemic and the way businesses have adapted to the changing environment. So again, we probably don't think 2020 is going to be a record year in terms of economic and market performance, but we certainly think the opportunity set's there to give us a pretty solid year, if not a very good year, in 2021. Obviously, there's a number of challenges the world still faces, particularly around the pandemic. We've got a new administration in the US, and there's continuing to be various sort of trade tensions between China and the US and even Australia and the US. But most of these things in the short term tend to be a bit overblown versus their longer term effects, and we expect that probably to continue into 2021 as well. So all in all, we think 2020 is a year we're very glad to have behind us, and no doubt most of you are as well. We're very much looking forward to the opportunities that 2021 brings. So have a happy and safe Christmas, and we'll see you all next year.